Hello and welcome back to my studio. It's Lois here from Lois and Morgana Davidson Art, and today I'm going to be sharing one of my daily sky practices with you. This beautiful windswept beach with a sort of grey blue sky and a few gulls wheeling in the air, sort of waiting to pick the spoils of the receding tide. If you're new to the channel, I'll just explain. I've been doing almost daily sky practices virtually ever since I started painting, which is now about 6 years ago. A regular or daily sky practice, if you have time, can be a really great way of progressing with watercolour, because not only do you learn about skies, but you learn so much about mixing the right values of paint, about sort of applying washes with big brushes, the balance between soft and hard areas, and how to create atmosphere in your landscape paintings. So I sketched out a scene really lightly on my Saunders Waterford cold press watercolour paper, which is taped to my board at an angle of about 20 to 30 degrees. I'm going to paint the sky wet in wet. So first I'm wetting the sky with clean water, leaving a few dry patches so I can get some soft and hard edges. I'm using a large wash brush. Any wash brush will do, whatever your preferred brush is. Mine at the moment is this Princeton Aqua Elite 1.5 inch Mottler. Now I'm wetting into the beach as well, but again leaving some dry patches, and now applying the sky wash. This is a mixture of cobalt blue, a touch of cerulean and some burnt sienna, which just brings it down a bit, sort of desaturates it and gives me this sort of blue-grey rather than either a pure blue or a pure grey, if you see what I mean. I'm painting around the clouds in certain places, so the white of the paper is giving me the lightest parts of the clouds. Working with my brush, dipping into clean water, removing excess water from the brush onto a paper towel so that the paint becomes lighter towards the horizon. And then starting to work into the sea, this time using the tips of the Mottler brush, making sure I keep my marks horizontal to keep the water flat, but leaving some unpainted patches for white crests and suggestions of waves and a tide line. I've added some sepia and some burnt sienna to my sky colour to give me this nice sort of dark, sort of greyish brown, which is lovely to start off my beach. Again, keeping the brush strokes horizontal and working around the marks that I've made for the sea, still leaving a few unpainted patches. Then I can sort of build up some shadow to give me some distance and recession until I come to the dunes in the distance. Just adding little bits of shadow into the sea here and there with that same colour, and bringing some of that colour, which is by now quite pale because the paint's been running out on my brush, so I can put a little bit of that pale brown into the sand dunes in the distance just to start them off. They'll be finished off when I come back and paint the second part of the painting using the wet on dry technique. But for now I'm quickly finishing off this wet on wet part. This is my 3/4 inch flat brush, which is really useful for creating these kinds of marks with the tips. And now I've swapped to a large mop brush, which is clean and damp, and I'm softening back, losing some of the edges in the foreground, just to soften back some areas and give that sort of sense of movement and a little bit of variety to the marks in the foreground. Then dragging a little bit of paler blue using the mop brush in between all the other colours that I've placed on the page. And with that final touch of pale blue, I now need to leave this stage to dry completely. So here's the dry wash. The sky is just about complete. There's a little hard edge that I'm going to soften back in a bit. But for now, I'm going to just put a bit of masking tape on my horizon line across the top. This means that when I put in a nice bright fresh blue to darken up the sea a little bit in places, I can keep my horizon line easily nice and straight. This is a good tip for beginners, but make sure that you do check that your painting is dry before you do this. If you place this onto a wet page, it either won't stick and you'll get nasty marks seeping under the tape, or it might tear your painting. This is my size 14 round brush, just using the tip of that to get a few shapes in across the tape, and then swapping again to my favourite flat brush for those lovely marks, working around the paint that's already on the page, excuse me, so some of that's showing through. This will lighten back a little bit, but it's a lovely bright colour. This has been mixed with cobalt blue, cerulean blue and burnt sienna, but this time I've mixed a darker value than I did for the sky and the sea in the first wash, so that it stands out. It's also got a little bit more blue in it, so it's a bit more intense. This will dry back a bit, but it'll still keep this beautiful freshness of the light from the sky reflected on the sea, hopefully. Introducing some of this colour up into the middle ground and the foreground, not too much in the foreground, but just enough to bring this colour forward, to give the impression in this loose painting of water coming up along into the beach, maybe some tide pools, that sort of thing. Now I've finished with the horizon line, so I'm going to remove my tape, and I'm just going to use a clean damp brush to soften up a couple of the marks that look a little bit heavy. You can see I've got my nice straight horizon, and just pulling a little bit of the paler blue across the beach or into the beach in the distance. Again, just a little bit of softening back where I think I might need it. But always keeping these brush strokes horizontal. I've added some Payne's Grey, Burnt Sienna and Sepia to my sky colour, and I'm using the tips of the flat brush to introduce some low lights around the highlights and around the blue. Again, keeping the brush strokes horizontal. Where my brush stroke hits the dry painting, I get a nice hard edge, but where it flows into an area of the sea that I've just painted, it will softly diffuse because I've created a wet in wet environment there with my previous brush strokes. And now coming up and beginning to work a little bit on the depth and the distance, getting some dark up in the far distance underneath the dunes, but softening it back a little bit, making it quite sort of pale and bluish grey, because cooler colours will recede. I'm taking my darker colour, my sort of brownish colour that I used for the beach, but quite a watery mix of it, so I've added a bit of water to it, and I'm using this dark colour now to paint in my dunes. I want them to be darker across the top where they've caught a bit of shadow. So I'm painting that in now, this first ridge. Then I'll clean out my brush, squeeze out all the water and use the brush to soften that brush stroke, and sort of merge it into the lighter background so that it becomes lighter as the dune comes down. Then painting the dune next to it, the one that's a little bit further back, in exactly the same way. As the dune disappears into the distance, you'll notice that I'm using lighter paint. I've taken the pressure off the brush so that I'm only using the point, and dragging that really thin so it just disappears off just over the horizon line. And I can just use that brush just to soften things back a little bit, keeping again the orientation of the brush stroke horizontal. A damp brush like this will just gently move a little paint around, and you can see that I'm just sort of almost blending very carefully here, just to add a small amount of tone to the distance, but without anything too obvious, so I keep my sense of recession. And then a clean damp brush, a flat brush, to soften back that darker mark in the sea. And now I want to leave the beach to dry completely before I finish it off. While it's drying, I'm going to just mend a little hard edge at the top. So I'm using a Rosemary & Co eradicator brush, dipped in clean water to soften that hard edge. Just softening it back really gently and giving it a very gentle scrub with this brush. And then a dab with a tissue. And that's just softened that slightly hard edge that I found a bit distracting. And now to leave everything to dry. Now that it's dry, I just want a bit of dry brush across the foreground just to add a bit of tone, but without any detail. So I'm using my size 14 round brush and the dark mixture, which I have loaded my brush, but then I've dabbed my brush out onto a piece of paper towel to remove nearly all the moisture, and then just dragging the brush across the texture of the paper. So I'm just hitting the bumps of the paper to give me this lovely dark dry brush. Hopefully that little bit of dry brush tone just gives a suggestion of the beach. In this loose painting, I don't want any detail, I just want to suggest the scene with my brushwork. And I'm happy with that. I think I'm going to add a couple of gulls in the sky. So I'm using a size 1 rigger brush and my dark mixture, and I'll just carefully paint in a few gulls, putting them over sort of lighter areas of the sky and trying to arrange them in a way that works well with the composition. And I think a few gulls really work nicely in this scene. It helps to complete the sky practice. Keeping them really small so they don't intrude too much. And I'm really pleased with this subtle sky. I think it works well to be fairly windswept, but subtle at the same time. So I remove the tape. I always like this part because it makes the sky practice look a bit more finished, and we can see it now with its clean white border, which looks almost as if it's framed. And I'm really pleased with this subtle sort of blue-grey sky and the sort of brighter blue in the sea, which is complemented by that sort of soft brown for the sand dunes and the beach. Well, I hope you found that helpful, and that if you don't already have a regular sky practice, that you'll maybe think about that if you're interested in progressing with your landscape painting. And here on the channel we have a really big playlist for sky practices, so you may be interested in taking a look, which might give you some inspiration and get you started. So thank you so much for watching. Please leave us a like and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already. And thanks so much to everybody that supports us on Patreon. We really do appreciate you, and we couldn't run the channel without your wonderful support. And if you'd like to support us, then please follow any of the links below. I'll see you again soon. Take care and happy painting. Bye.